simple. It is simple. So what we're going to do is we're going to have you sit at your chairs, and we're going to open the floor for discussion around any of the topics that relates to math, that relates to English language arts, that relates to implementation that we've discussed today. And we're going to take until about 4 o'clock, so 40 minutes we'll have for Q&A, and then we'll continue on with the rest of our agenda and allow our esteemed speakers to dismiss. Okay, so, I will, this is going to be free form from the standpoint of if you have a question, raise your hand to be recognized, and then we'll go from there. And the floor recognizes Dr. Shai.
We have people.
A question for Dr. Milgram. The National Math Advisory Panel published some guidelines for when certain mathematics skills should be mastered by students. I was wondering what your opinion of those are.
Yeah, well, they primarily in algebra,
A little bit of geometry, most
but primarily in algebra.
multiplication, division, all kinds of
But
things.
basically, they had worked very, very hard on this, and I think they basically got the list right.
Okay. And I have been looking across a number of different non-common core standards, and the only one I can clearly identify as meeting these NMAP standards is Minnesota. Do you know of any other states which?
Well, I think, so California was written by 4 of us at Stanford.
Yeah, but that's all defunct, right?
Oh, it's all defunct, of course,
Right.
but the old standards were pretty well met the requirements. And the same with Massachusetts, the same with Indiana.
Okay.
There were a small number of states that met them, and a large number that didn't come close.
Okay.
So let me make sure I understand. So what current states could we look at now as examples of getting it right with math? Is it just Minnesota, I think, Dr. Scheich, was your question, or are there other current implementations?
I mean, if that was the question, the answer is just Minnesota.
Okay.
But do we have access to previous standards?
Yes, you do.
Those are the ones that I would like to see.
They're all public information. They're all
And,
produced by
for example,
taxpayers' money.
For example, I have a PDF of the 2005 California framework, not just the standards, but the entire framework. And I'd be glad to distribute that to people.
That'd be wonderful.
The chair recognizes James.
I've got 2 or 3 questions, and then probably other comments will probably generate more just to get started. I was curious, we've had a lot of conversations about the age appropriateness and developmental appropriateness of several of these standards, especially as regards the lower grades, and I think in many ways more language arts than in the math. But I'm sure math as well. I wondered, were there any folks that had these strengths that were on the Common Core Committee to write it, or the validation group that could look at the age appropriateness of this as far as you know?
Well, let me answer for math. I was, and Jerry was someone who was very, very well versed in the age appropriateness issues, and there were a few other people in validation. To be honest, the only person on the writing team or the extended writing team that was highly competent or knowledgeable in that area was a middle school teacher, Vern Williams. But that was a rare bird on the writing teams. But there were a number of us in validation. Unfortunately, validation wasn't able to validate after a certain point, and certainly wasn't able to, the critiques from validation could be listened to or not, but we had no control.
As far as ELA is concerned, you can Google it. There is a petition developed by over 250 early childhood educators. Came out a few years ago, and one of their major complaints was that there were no early childhood educators, either on the writing committees or the immediate feedback committees. They simply felt they weren't involved at all, and that this was one of the major reasons accounting for the inappropriateness of a lot of the standards in the early grades.
From an implementation perspective, though, in regards to age appropriateness, I think it's really essential, again, to remember that while we may define, or state may define, where we hope a child will be at any given point, the reality is, within any given classroom, you'll have students all along that continuum. And it's still essential. Teachers will never have, no matter how we define a grade level standard, students always at that level of the continuum, because even when things are going great, they will be above. So again, it's essential that teachers have the ability and the knowledge to know all this. Again, it's the progression in the continuum that really is essential too.
That was a nice segue to my next question.
There you go.
There's a hand over there too.
Oh, okay.
Hey there, I'll let her go.
Oh, I have, yes.
Sorry.
I got one more after this.
There you go.
In Forsyth County, for example, we have 14% of our students who are non-English speaking students when they enter kindergarten, totally. And how do you see, and when you read the kindergarten standards, they're mind-boggling. And, I mean, they're so inappropriate, even for kids who have, for a lot of kids who at least speak the language. But we've got kids coming into kindergarten who have no English language skills at all. A lot of kids that have never seen a pencil before. And these standards are, to me, much out. No way. I mean, these kids spend the first year trying to learn basic English language.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see, what do you see as subject masters? How do you see this affecting these children who are, there's no time, there's no flexibility to get them on a base to start the standards? I mean, I've been told that in Wake County, every teacher has to be, and they check to make sure on a certain day you're on a certain standard. So, what's the answer for these kids with Common Core?
Let me ask you, first of all, in North Carolina, is there K-2 testing required? Many states have come out against K-2 standardized testing. I don't know what the situation here in North Carolina is.
We have no state levels.
No state level tests,
For
okay.
standardization.
Then this has to be handled at the local level, as it always was. As far as I know, the USED had made no arrangements several years ago for ESL, or English Language Learners, and has been working with a group of people to develop alternative standards, but what has come of that, I don't know if it's finalized or not. But before that, most state departments of ed had developed documents for English language learners. Whether they were good or not, I'm not talking about, but they were attempting to deal with the problem. And sometimes you simply have transitional classes. You have what are called welcome schools or newcomer schools, something like that, for children who need to be given some initial English language training before they go into a regular public classroom. And this can be a state level or an individual local level policy.
My last question, and I apologize for my questions not being very specific, but these countries that you mentioned, India and Japan, Russia, do they hold every single one of their students to these high standards, or is there a weeding out process very, I mean, I asked this because we,
Yes. Actually, what I showed you, or tried to show you, was the focus of those curricula. I mean, when you have a curriculum as small as that first grade curriculum, then virtually every student is going to learn it.
yes.
Now, if the curriculum, if the people who write the standards really know what they're doing, they're going to focus on just the few critical standards, as was done in the example I gave you, and not the 20 or 30 or 40, I mean, those are 20 or 30 standards, each of which is really 5. And so not the, more realistically, 100 standards in first grade. They're going to focus on, as they did there, the 2 standards that I started with. And you take those 2 standards, and over a year, you'll find that most of the kids learn them. Now, what is the data for these countries? Well, I happen to know the data, and I'll mention it. Okay, and you can believe it or not, but this is the data. That in most of those countries, over 90% of the citizenry have a high school diploma. In fully half of them, the high school diploma requires calculus. And, well, what can I tell you? With that kind of statistic, you can be pretty sure that virtually every one of the kids has learned the basic stuff, certainly in K through 4.
Well, I do think we are, I know Dr. White was very much a proponent of looking at international math standards. And, I mean, to me, math is math. 2 + 2 is 4 in whatever country. And if we could identify some international math standards that have high quality, that make sense to the math folks, I think instead of just looking at different states, we ought to take this suggestion and maybe look at some other countries and their math standards.
So Dr. Miller, what I hear you saying, and Dr. Miller is working it out, that what you're advocating is for mastery of content, mastering the content before moving forward. And I think Dr. Scheich was very succinct in putting it that the Common Core standards tries to cover so much information that it's a mile wide and an inch deep. And is that what you're saying, that there's more of a...
Yeah, well, they
mastery?
advertised, one of the main advertised purposes of Common Core was to present a bunch of standards that were short and concise and not a mile wide and an inch deep. Well, they got their mile wide and inch deep by the device of, as I showed you, putting 5 or more standards into one and doing it fairly consistently. So you're perfectly right. Common Core, as it stands, is amazingly like, when you really parse it and take it apart, it's like the middle level standards that preceded it.
If I can just go back to your previous question, because it gets at another element of implementation that I think, again, gets at the complexity in regards to the English language learners. So going back to my presentation where, when we think about the work teachers need to do to use standards to develop, the curriculum, instruction, and assessment resources, when you think about it almost at the lesson level, for teachers who have English language learners in their classroom, they have an additional set of standards to consider. So the English language proficiency standards. So again, when we think about the complexity, I might be needing to teach a student the particular skills and knowledge within a math standard, say, but at the same time, I'm also trying to help those students meet standards in English language proficiency through the learning of math. And again, when we think about implementing standards well, teachers need to learn and need support in implementing their content standards, oftentimes in relation to literacy and language standards for English language learners. So again, inordinately complex, requires a lot of PD and support.
I think we're working our way around, I'm sorry, Katie Lemons. I think we're working our way around this issue. I would love to know each of your thoughts on quantity of standards. Just quantity, and I think I might know what Dr. Milgram might think, but quantity of standards. Does that equal rigor? So often teachers, I teach 9th and 10th grade English, and we hear, okay, there's gonna be more standards, and that's gonna increase the rigor. Does quantity equal rigor, or the converse of that? Does a
Well-
small amount of standards mean a subpar?
The trouble is, if you could look at what the schools of education define as rigor, it doesn't look anything like what a mathematician would define as rigor. So what I mean by rigorous is basically the most important thing I mean is important and correct. And somehow in the education world, creative is a major component of rigor. Well, so it depends on what you mean when you use the term rigor. Now, there's no question that I'm applying the mathematical definition. That is, I want these kids to come out, at least in mathematics, knowing what the processes are, being able to do them at the level that they're expected to be able to do them, and to do them accurately and correctly.
In speaking for myself, not other teachers, I so often feel that rigor is equated with more difficult work and higher levels of it, as opposed to, and personally I love what you said, rigor means important and correct. You're right,
Well,
there are many definitions of rigor.
There are many definitions, as I said.
It's
and-
grade specific, first of all. You have to decide what grade level you're talking about rigor. Rigor in grade 7 is different from rigor in grade 11, English language arts.
No, it's not different in math.
You can speak for math and English. A
I'm
rigorous
carefully
curriculum
doing that.
in grade 7 might be very unrigorous in grade 11. So you have to decide what you mean for the particular subject.
So we can't have a general statement of these standards will create rigor if we're not looking at it.
Well, you've got to define what you mean by rigor. And I have in English language arts actually come out with like 8 or 9 different ways for looking at English language arts standards, not math standards, for deciding what rigor means. And you have to start with what you mean for a particular grade level. I mean, if you're going to expect the 5-paragraph essay in grade 4, that's not rigor, that's utopian and it's ridiculous. The views of children, I mean. So you have to figure out what you mean with respect to a particular grade level or developmental level. Rigor at the college level is going to be different because there you're dealing supposedly with mature readers.
But again, that's perfectly legitimate in ELA. But in math, it really is different.
I think we can probably move past this point, but Katie, you stimulated an interesting point, which is we do need to, as a commission, define what we mean by rigor and recognize that it's differential depending on math or ELA, so.
Well, it's also dependent on the development of the child as well, which is why we had intended to bring in, unfortunately, we had a little situation last month with our snow and issues like that, but, to bring in some child development experts who could inform us on what is appropriate at what age level, because a lot of that is driven by child development, is it not? Maybe not for math.
Yeah, again, because we should know, we certainly, the high achieving countries do know what are the critical components of math education. Because you can focus down that precisely, you get to my definition of rigor for virtually every kid. And more or less at grade level.
Yes, and did you have a comment?
I think Katie had a question.
I was just wondering if Dr. Burks had any thoughts on quantity of standards, especially when it comes to implementation.
Two thoughts. One is in regards to rigor. I think there's some experts out there that you could look two, I'd have to go back, I can send them to you. But one definition that I've often seen is sort of a three-part rubric for that. And again, from an implementation standpoint, what we encourage teachers to look at is readiness of what students need to learn now is we want it to be durable. So for example, is what they're learning now, will it be durable? Will it leverage future learning? And will it prepare them to learn the knowledge and skills in the next sequence and iteration of standards at the next level? So durability, leverageability, and that sort of leading to the next phase of learning. So that students, again, you've got this, it's a appropriate level of challenge, but the key thing when we talk about rigor is it's essential, this goes back to motivation, but when we assess students or when we implement standards, we want students to be successful. We want them to feel challenged because it's meaningful when it's challenging, but at the same time we want to guarantee their success. Quantity, I really can't speak to quantity, not being a standards expert, but I do know one researcher that I think has done work in this area is Robert Marzano. I think his book, What Works in Schools, I think it's 2009, it was pre-Common Core, but one of the things he looked at was, did an analysis of state standards and kind of went through and sort of looked at different states and their standards and how much time it would actually take to teach all of the standards. And what his finding was that a lot of state standards had way too many. In general, in implementation, national standards, whether it be the ARCH or what have you, the national standards tend to be a little bit more pithy. And from an implementation standpoint, in working with teachers to use standards to develop curriculum instruction and assessment materials, haven't really encountered really problems there. If they know the standards well and they have capacity to work with their teachers collaboratively, they can use the standards effectively. But the key is developing curriculum instruction. If teachers are being asked to teach standards standard by standard by standard by standard, there will always be too many. They need to be taught how to teach and develop instructional resources that can teach multiple skills and knowledge across a cluster of standards. So again, a lot of it really comes down to the effectiveness of implementation and the ability to do that than any magic.
And so much of that comes down to the district and teacher.
Could you speak louder, please? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, and I was just commenting that so much of what he was speaking about would come down to the district and the teacher level,
And
that how to implement and the collaboration.
support at that level.
Right.
Thank you.
You have to have examples to know what you're talking about. This is a good part of the problem. And in English language arts, as opposed to, say, math or other subjects, you can specify specific works and then have English teachers discuss where is difficulty or complexity. Well-trained English teachers can do this. I have seen many, for example, with Shakespeare's plays over a 4-year period of time. Get a group of English teachers together and they will pretty much agree that Romeo and Juliet can be taught in grade 9. Julius Caesar in grade 10 is a little more complex. Go into Hamlet or King Lear or Macbeth by 11 or 12 because they are more complex and difficult. So that is where you can see rigor in at least one dimension for one author, one genre. But this is the level of specificity that you have to deal with in order to get something that is meaningful. And you can do it with English teachers, with the curriculum. It just takes time, because I have seen superintendents who've tried to do it with their English teachers. It may take years to get them to work out specific works, but that's how they work out what the rigor of a curriculum is. You have to deal with specific works or specific grade levels, and then decide what are the features of those works that they would agree in general make for either ease of teaching or more difficult complexity of teaching. And if they've got experience, they can bring that to bear for a wide range of students.
And again, let me re-emphasize that the distinction, one of the distinctions between ELA and math is that complexity does not come into